Chapter 3, Exile in Paris. 1. The Deutsche Französische Jahrbuch. The new publication was not born under a lucky star. A double volume was published at the end of February, 1844. It was the first number and also the last. It proved impossible to realize the Gallo-Germanic principle, or as Rouhet had renamed it, the intellectual alliance between France and Germany. The political principle of France showed no eagerness to accept Germany's contribution, the logical acumen of Hegelian philosophy, which was to serve it as a sure compass in the metaphysical regions where Rouhet saw the French drifting at the mercy of wind and wave. Rouhet intended to approach first Lamartine, Lamennais, Louis Blanc, Leroux, and Proudhon, but even this preliminary list was mixed enough in all conscience. Only Leroux and Proudhon had any idea of German philosophy, and of these two, one lived in the provinces whilst the other had temporarily abandoned writing in order to rack his brains over the invention of a typesetting machine. The others, including even Louis Blanc, who regarded anarchism in politics as a development from atheism in philosophy, all refused to cooperate, advancing this or that religious objection. On the other hand, however, the new publication collected an imposing array of German contributors. Apart from the editors themselves there were Heine, Herwe, and Johann Jacobi, all names of the first magnitude, whilst in the second rank, Moses Hess and a young lawyer from the Palatinate named F.C. Bernays were men of consequence, not to mention the youngest contributor of all, Friedrich Engels, who, after various excursions into the field of authorship, now appeared in the arena for the first time in full armor and with raised visor. But even this German band was mixed. Some of them understood little of Hegelian philosophy and still less of its logical acumen, and, above all, disagreement between the two editors themselves soon arose and rendered further cooperation impossible. The double number, which was to prove its one and only issue, opened with correspondence between Marx, Rouhet, Feuerbach, and Bakunin, a young Russian who had attached himself to Rouhet in Dresden and written a much-discussed contribution to the Deutsche Jahrbuch. This correspondence consists of 8 letters, each signed with the initials of its author, and showing us that 3 each were written by Marx and Rouhet, and 1 each by Bakunin and Feuerbach. At a later date Rouhet declared that the correspondence was his work, though he had used extracts from real letters here and there. It is included in his collected works, but, significantly with serious mutilations and the suppression of the final letter, which is signed with the initials of Marx and contains the real point of the whole correspondence. The contents of the letters leave no doubt that they are really the work of the authors whose initials they bear, and, as far as they represent a uniform composition, Marx plays the first fiddle in the concert. It is not necessary, however, to deny that Rouhet may have tinkered with his own letters and those of Bakunin and Feuerbach. Marx opened and closed the correspondence. His introduction is like a short and spirited fanfare. The Romanticist reaction was leading to revolution. The state was much too serious a matter to be degraded to the level of a harlequinade. A shipload of fools might drift before the wind for quite a time before anything happened, but it would finally meet its doom just because the fools refused to believe it. Whereupon Rouhet answered with a long Jeremiad on the inexhaustible and sheep-like patience of the German Philistine. His contribution was plaintive and helpless as he afterwards declared himself, or as Marx replied immediately and more politely, "Your letter is a good elegy, a breath-robbing dirge, but it is not in the least political. If the world was the property of the Philistines then it was worthwhile studying these lords of the world, although the Philistine was the lord of the world only because, like worms in a corpse, he filled the world with his society. So long as the Philistine was the material basis of the monarchy, the monarch himself could never be more than king of the Philistines." More wide awake and alive than his father, the new king of Prussia had attempted to dissolve the Philistine state on its own ground, but so long as the Philistines remained Philistines he would be able to make neither himself nor his subjects really free men. Thus the old petrified servile and slave state had returned, but even in this desperate situation there was new hope. Marx then pointed to the incompetence of the masters and the inertia of their servants and subjects, who let everything come and go as God pleased. The two qualities together were sufficient to bring about a catastrophe. He pointed to the enemies of Philistinism, all thinking and suffering men, who had come to an understanding. He even pointed to the passive system of perpetuation on the part of the old loyal subjects which daily was soliciting recruits in the cause of a new humanity, while the system of profits and trading, of property and the exploitation of humanity, was leading even more rapidly to a split within society. a split which the old system would be unable to repair because it did not heal and create, but only exist and enjoy. The task was therefore to drag the old world into the full light of day, and to develop the new world along positive lines. Both Bakunin and Feuerbach wrote encouragingly, each in his own way, to Rouhet, who thereupon declared that he had been converted by the new anarchasis and the new philosophers. Feuerbach compared the end of the Deutsche Jahrbucher with the end of Poland, declaring that the efforts of a few men must prove ineffective in the general quagmire of a rotten society, and Rouhet then wrote to Marx, "As the Catholic faith and aristocratic freedom failed to save Poland, so theological philosophy and respectable science failed to save us. We can get rid of our past only by making a decisive breach with it. The Jahrbucher are dead and Hegelian philosophy belongs to the past. Let us strive for an organ in Paris in which we can criticize ourselves and Germany as a whole with complete freedom and relentless honesty." Marx had the first word and he also had the last. Clearly, a new rallying point must be created for thinking and independent brains. Although there was no doubt about the past, there was confusion enough about the future. General anarchy has broken out amongst the reformers, and all of them would be compelled to admit that they have no exact ideas about the future. However, it is precisely the advantage of the new movement that we do not seek to anticipate the new world dogmatically, but rather to discover it in the criticism of the old. Up to now the philosophers have always had the solution of the riddle lying ready in their writing desks. And all the stupid external world had to do was to close its eyes and open its mouth to receive the ready-baked pie of absolute science. Philosophy has become secular, and the most striking proof of this is that the philosophic consciousness itself has been drawn into the heat of the fray not only superficially, but thoroughly. It is certainly not our task to build up the future in advance and to settle all problems for all time, but it is just as certainly our task to criticize the existing world ruthlessly. I mean ruthlessly in the sense that we must not be afraid of our own conclusions and equally unafraid of coming into conflict with the prevailing powers. Marx had no desire to unfurl any dogmatic standard, and communism as preached by Cabet, Dizemy and Weitling he regarded as a dogmatic abstraction. Whether one liked it or not, the chief interest of contemporary Germany was in religion and only secondarily in politics. It was no use presenting them with a ready-made system such as was contained in the Journey to a Career. One must begin with them just as they were. Marx condemned the attitude of the crass socialists who felt that political questions were beneath their dignity. Social truth could be arrived at everywhere from the contradiction in the political state, from the conflict between its ideal mission and its practical hypothesis. There is therefore nothing to prevent us beginning our criticism with a criticism of politics, taking part in politics, that is to say, in real struggles. In this way we should avoid presenting ourselves to the world in a doctrinaire fashion and with a new principle, declaring, "Here is truth, bow down and worship it." We should develop new principles for the world out of its old principles. We must not say to the world, "Stop your quarrels, they are foolish," and listen to us. We possess the real truth. Instead we must show the world why it struggles, and this consciousness is a thing it must acquire whether it likes it or not. Marx sums up the program of the new organ as follows: to assist the age to come to a realization of its struggles and its wishes. Marx came to this realization, but not Rouhet. Even the correspondence shows that Marx was the driver and Rouhet the driven. A supplementary factor was that after his arrival in Paris Rouhet fell ill and was able to take very little part in the editorial work. He was thus unable to exercise his chief capacity to the full, and Marx seemed to him too circumstantial for the purpose. Rouhet was unable to give the organ the form and the attitude which he considered the most suitable, and he was even unable to publish a contribution of his own in it. However, he was not altogether displeased with the first issue, and he found some quite remarkable things in it which will create a sensation in Germany. Although he complained that a number of unpolished things had been served up in a hurry and that he would have improved them, the undertaking would probably have continued to appear, but for the fact that a number of outside hindrances prevented it. First of all, the funds of the Literarisches Kontor soon became exhausted, and Froebel declared that he could not carry on without more money, and secondly, the Prussian government took action immediately after the first announcement of the publication of the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbucher. Its action, however, met with little sympathy from Metternich and less from Guizot, and it had to stop for the moment with informing the governors of all Prussian provinces that the Jahrbucher represented high treason and lèse-majesté, and this it did on the 18th of April, 1844. At the same time the governors were instructed to have their police arrest Rouhet. Marx, Heine and Bernays with as little stir as possible and to confiscate their papers should they set foot on Prussian soil. As a hare must be caught before it can be jugged, this action was comparatively harmless. But the uneasy conscience of the King of Prussia became more dangerous when it caused him to instruct his subordinates to increase their vigilance at the frontiers. They succeeded in confiscating 100 copies of the Deutsche Französische Jahrbucher on a Rhine steamer, and well over 200 copies on the French Palatinate frontier near Bergzabern. In view of the very small circulation with which the publishers were entitled to reckon, these were very grievous blows. Where internal differences already exist, they are readily embittered and accentuated by external difficulties. According to Rouhet, these circumstances accelerated his breach with Marx or even caused it. And there may be something in this, because whilst Marx always displayed a sovereign indifference in money matters, Rouhet did just the contrary, displaying the suspicious avarice of a grocer. He did not hesitate to apply the truck system when paying out the salary agreed upon to Marx, presenting him with copies of the Jahrbucher in lieu of money, and he became really indignant at an alleged suggestion that he should risk his money in an attempt to proceed with the publication, pointing out that he had no knowledge of the book trade. In a similar situation Marx certainly risked his own money, but it is very unlikely that he proposed the same to Rouhet. Perhaps he advised Rouhet not to throw down the cards at the first failure, and it is possible that Rouhet, who had already been angered by a proposal that he should put up a few more francs to secure publication of Weitling's works, suspected this advice to be a dangerous attack on his pocketbook. Further, Rouhet himself indicates the real reason for the breach when he admits that the immediate occasion was a quarrel about Ower, whom he had called a rogue. Though perhaps with rather too much emphasis, whilst Marx had stressed Ower's great future. As a matter of fact, as far as Ower was concerned, Rouhet was right. The man had no great future, and the mode of life he was leading in Paris at the time would really seem to have been open to objection. Even Heine condemned him sharply, whilst Rouhet himself admits that Marx also was none too pleased with the man. In any case, the generous Serra did more honour to the bitter and malignant Marx than the uncanny instinct did to the honest and irreproachable Rouhet. For Marx was concerned with the revolutionary poet whilst Rouhet was thinking of petty bourgeois morality. This was the deeper significance of the insignificant incident which separated the two men forever. The breach with Rouhet did not possess the political significance of the later polemics with Bruno Bauer and Proudhon. As a revolutionary, Marx had probably been annoyed with Rouhet for a long time before the quarrel about Ower caused his bile to rise, even assuming that it all took place exactly as Rouhet describes. If one wishes to know Rouhet from his best side, one must read the memoirs which he published about 20 years later. The 4 volumes deal with his life up to the time when the Deutsche Jahrbucher ceased publication, that is to say, throughout a period when Rouhet was an irreproachable example of that literary advance-guard of schoolmasters and students who spoke on behalf of a bourgeoisie which lived from small trading and great illusions. They contain a wealth of charming genre pictures from Rouhet's childhood, spent on the lowlands of Rügen and Pomerania, and they give a description, unique in German literature, of the stirring times of the Burschenschaften and the demagogue hunt. Rouhet's misfortune was that his memoirs appeared at a time when the German bourgeoisie was beginning to abandon its great illusions in favor of big business. And so his memoirs went almost without notice, whilst Reuter's Festungsted, a book incomparably inferior both historically and as literature, was received with storms of applause. Rouhet had really been an active member of the Burschenschaften, whereas Reuter had casually fallen in with them. However, the German bourgeoisie was already flirting with Prussian bayonets, and it much preferred Reuter's golden humour and the jocular manner in which he treated the infamous mockery of justice committed in the days of the demagogue hunt, to the audacious humour, to quote Freiligrot's appropriate words, with which Rouhet described how his jailers had faded to break his spirit and how he won inner liberty during his imprisonment. But even in the graphic descriptions of Rouhet one feels keenly that pre-March liberalism was in the last resort nothing but Philistinism despite all its fine words, and that its spokesmen were Philistines and must remain so to the last. Rouhet was the most high-spirited of them all, and within his ideological limits he fought bravely enough. But the same temperament made his defection all the easier when in Paris he came face to face with the great contradictions of modern life. He had reconciled himself with socialism as the hobby of philosophic humanists, but the communism of the Paris artisans filled him with panic-stricken horror and Philistine fear. not so much for his personal safety as for his pocketbook. In the Deutsch-Französische Jahrbuch he had signed the death warrant of Hegelian philosophy with a flourish, but before the year was out he had welcomed its most grotesque successor, the philosophy of Stirner, as a champion against communism which he regarded as the most stupid of all stupidities, as the new Christianity preached by the simple, as a system whose realization would mean the degeneration of human society into a farmyard. The breach between Rouhet and Marx became irreparable.